Hey all, welcome to the Docker Analogy series where we are learning and mastering Docker. In the last video, we talked about Docker networking, which is going to help us understand the concept of multi-container application that we are going to discuss in this video. Moving on, now if you remember in the very first video, we talked about how microservices architecture is about packaging one thing in one container. And if you look at the current architecture of our application, right, this is my host machine and where my Docker daemon and OS everything exists, and I'm running a container called to-do app container. And in this to-do app container, we have packaged everything, right? We have app code which is packaged inside that, and we have SQLite DB which is packaged inside one container. Now, obviously, this is a violation of a microservice architecture. We also lose the flexibility or the advantages that we had discussed. For example, I want to scale my app container independent of my data container. Because let's say my compute has increased, and in order to support that compute power, I need to increase my app containers. If I do that, then I will equally scale my SQLite data as well, right? Which is not what I'm looking for. I'm just losing my unwanted data if I scale app and SQLite at the same time. I want SQLite to be separate. What I mean is I want to separate the app logic and my data storage container, and whenever app container or my to-do app container wants to communicate, it can communicate via Docker networking concept that we just discussed in the last video. So the idea is to store data in a separate container, and app logic will say stay in a separate container, and this way we can achieve the scaling. Let's see how this can be done in a practical way. So let me go back to my command prompt. I think if you already have some containers running from the last video, feel free to wipe them out. Let's do that. So docker rm is for removing the dockers. Okay, then let's stop the all docker containers though. So docker stop to do app 1, to do app 2, and then I have the containers which are in, I have these two containers which are running, which are in exited state. Let me clean them up as well. So docker rm and then docker ps, like list all the running containers, minus a list all the containers which is running and exited, minus q is basically it outputs the container id only. Okay, and this is what is needed to for this rm command. So all the containers are now exited. Okay, so we are good there. Now what we want to do is basically we want to run this data storage container. So in our application we have a facility, right? So far we have been using SQLite, which is, we know, not a production grade database. We want to run, or we want to store our data in a MySQL database, and we already have that facility present in our code. So if I go back to my persistent package, and if I go to index, here you can see it says if the environment variable host is passed, MySQL host, then what we will export from this persistent storage is MySQL. Okay, if this is not passed, then the default database that I am exporting is SQLite. So that's why by default when we are not passing any MySQL host, SQLite was actually was being used to store the data. Okay, but if we pass a MySQL host as a part of the environment variable, then the .mysql package or a source file will kick in, and it will try to store all the operations, or it will try to perform all the operations on MySQL database. Okay, so in order to do that, let's first independently run the MySQL DB. Okay, and see how can we use that to connect or how that can be used to store our data. So let me first get the database. So let me go to hub.docker.com Then I need to search MySQL. Okay, so let's go to, so this is the Docker official image for MySQL. Let's go in there. Okay, so there are a lot of new images are available. Okay, 8.0, 8.0 seems to be there, 8.2.0 seems to be there. Okay, let's go down below. So how do we start a MySQL instance? Okay, so you start a MySQL instance, let's say by giving it some name. Then you pass the environment variable, which is MySQL root. Okay, and then along with that you can pass many other variables as well. Okay, and then you can also, yeah, let's go down here. I think I'll show you some of the variables that can be used actually. If you go, yeah, so if you look at this, these are the environment variables. So this is your root password that you're going to pass, and if you don't pass your username, by default it will be a root username. Okay, and there are other variables that you can choose to pass when you are configuring your MySQL database, and you can read through this as well. Now let's try, let's run the database now. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using the latest Docker image 8.2.0, I will use 8.0. That's the image that I had used in the past. Okay, but if you have experience with running with 8.2.0, feel free to go ahead for that. I don't think a lot of things have changed in terms of what environment variables we are passing between 8.0 and 8.2.0. okay, feel free to experiment. You'll end up learning something new for sure. So I will do docker run -d. I want to run in a detached mode. Okay, I think before I do that, let me do this docker network ls. So we have this existing network, to do app network running. Okay, and we know if you want two containers to talk to each other, they have to be on the same network. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this up, and I'm going to create a new network. Okay, so docker network rm, I'm going to remove this. Okay, and going to create a new network, docker network create, obviously to do app. That's the name I'm going to give to my network, docker network ls now. So to do app is created. Okay, now I'm going to run docker run in a detached mode. Then my network which I want to connect this MySQL container is to do app. Okay, and then I want to give a network alias. Okay, I will explain in a bit what this network alias does. I will name it MySQL. Okay, now let's discuss, before I proceed, let's discuss what network alias is. I think we when we are talking about networking, docker networking, we didn't discuss about this. Okay, I remember we discussed that if you want to connect to the other container, you can do so using the container name. But also what network alias option in Docker is, so what it does, it is used to assign the additional network aliases to a container when it's connected to a Docker network. So these aliases are, you can consider them as a alternative names or host name. So either you can use -- name, or you can use the network alias and give this name. Okay, so that when app container, to do app container has to connect to this MySQL container, they can use MySQL as a name. This is the network alias name or alternative name that we are giving to this container through which we will connect eventually. I hope that you understood. Okay, then -v, we want to store the data. Okay, so let's say name of the file is MySQL data, and by default what's going to happen is when MySQL data, MySQL is going to store this data. By default it stores the data in a directory called var lib MySQL. Now if you remember in persistent topic that we discussed, right, how to persist the data in Docker, so we had used the bind mount. This is same as bind mount. Okay, what we are saying is this is my source, meaning in my current directory. Okay, I will create this file. Okay, and you will mount, or this data or this folder under the container gets mounted on this specific file, okay, or this specific folder. That's the relation, right? Earlier, if you remember, we had used source. So this is your source, okay, and this is your target, and type is by default the bind mount, okay. How that clears. Then the environment variable we want to pass is, if you remember, if I go back to this, okay, passing the root password, we are going to pass the root password here, okay. So let's do that. MySQL root password. Let's say I can give anything, but I'll give it secret. Then -e. Then I want to pass the database name also. So MySQL database is equal to to-dos. I will give this name to-dos, okay. And so this MySQL database is name coming from the setup, you know. So you can look at, this is the environment variable we are passing, where through which you can set up your database. And then what image I want to run this on. So I will select MySQL 8.0. Now you can see the container is running. If I do docker ps, you can see I have this MySQL container which is up and running, okay. The one way to check is to enter into this container. Let's try docker exec -it, and then the container name, and then enter into this, okay. Now we are already inside that container. Let's run -sql -u root, okay, and then -p. Enter the password that we had added. This is the password we had added, so secret. So we are into the MySQL shell now. If I do show databases, okay, you will see the to-dos database that we got created, okay. So that sets the point, you know, that sets our MySQL container up and running. We exited from MySQL shell. We are exiting from the container shell also. And yeah, just want to cross check. Yeah, the container is up and running now, okay. Now according to this architecture, this part, data storage container, is up. It stores the MySQL data, okay. I mean, it has a MySQL database engine which is going to store the data. So now let's talk about our app container now, okay. Now what we want to do is, now let's run our app container. So docker run, and then I want to run in a detached mode. I want to publish my port 3000:3000, okay. And then network, let's add network is to do app, okay. Now if you go back to the MySQL, right, if you go to this MySQL file, okay, there are a set of variables that it is asking us to provide, okay. So first is the MySQL host. So we will pass this. So you can see these are all the environment, you know, this will all get passed to environment variables. So let's pass those values. So MySQL underscore host. Now if you remember, this is the network alias that we had shared, okay, and that's how we will pass. So our app container will try to connect to the MySQL container. Then we're talking about MySQL user. MySQL user by default is root. Then -e MySQL password. Now here you have to pass the same password that you had passed while creating a MySQL database, because it will try to connect using these credentials. So it will use the root as the username, MySQL as the host, and secret as the password, okay. And what's the database name where we want to store the data is MySQL underscore DB is equals to to-dos. If you remember, that's the name that we had given while creating the database. Let me go up a little bit. Okay, I can't seem to find. Okay, can't seem to find it now. Okay, so that's the database name, and what's the image that I'm running? So Sushil Kadu to do app colon 0.0.2 and then minus. Okay, looks like I pressed enter without. So I wanted to give a name, but anyway, our container is running right now. If I do docker ps, you can see the container is up and running. I wanted to give it a name so that it doesn't get this random name. Anyway, I should have given name to both the containers, this MySQL container and this container also, because it's hard to identify. But fortunately we have this image from where we can identify. But let's imagine you have, let's say 50 containers running, then it becomes difficult, right? So the name really helps here. So let me do docker log. So let me get logs from this container, right? So you can see it was waiting for it is waiting to connect to the MySQL database, and it finally connected. So it says connected to MySQL DB. Okay, and now if I run our application, right, localhost 3000, well, it is going to store all the data in a MySQL database now. Okay, so let's say item 1, item 2, item 3. Okay, now this all the data is actually getting stored inside inside the MySQL database. Okay, so let's do nothing. So let's go into current MySQL container. Okay, so if I go to MySQL container now, docker exec -it sh where to etc var lib MySQL. Okay, so this is the place where data is getting stored. Okay, to-dos is the database. I mean, this is the internal structure, but this is where the data is actually getting stored. And when we did a -v option, so if you remember, we ran MySQL container. So let me do history here so that I can explain from there. So if you look at this specific, right, image that we MySQL image that we run. Okay, so when we did -v, this is basically the volume that we created automatically. Okay, this is not a, I think I might have mistakenly said that it is creating a file locally on the host machine, but it is actually the volume that gets created on the host machine. That's the volume that gets created. So if I do docker volume ls, you will see the volume that is getting created. Okay, and then if you want to inspect this further, you can choose to inspect this further like this, and you will see where the actual data is getting stored on the host machine. Okay, okay, so yeah, so now if we do docker ps, we have two independent container running, which is your to-do app container and your data container, which is MySQL container, same as this architecture that we wanted to achieve. I hope this helps you understand the concept end to end. How can we run this multi-container app, and how each thing can be packaged inside only one container. For example, your data is a separate container, your app logic is a separate container, and that helps you in scaling. But managing these containers on their own becomes a challenge. So in the next video, we are going to look at how to manage these multi-container apps in a better way. Okay, so see you in the next video then.